Over my short time here on YouTube, I've had many requests to take on Matt Slick's transcendental argument for God, and I can understand why. On the surface, the argument seems hard to understand, and in turn, hard to debunk. But as the philosopher Alex Malpass demonstrated to Slick himself, it's not. It's actually easy to convey and easy to debunk. The difficulty is in how Slick presents it, and in how he conflates it with another one of his arguments, which I'm not going to take on within this video. This is Matt Slick's transcendental argument, Debunked. The full defence of Slick's transcendental argument can be found on calm.org, but as you can see from this screenshot, it's fairly lengthy and most of his defence is either clarifying definitions or making assertions that are universally accepted, which is useful, but the argument itself is at the end of his defence, and it goes as follows. If we have only two possible options by which we can explain something, and one of those options is removed, by default the other option is verified since it's impossible to negate both of the only two existing options. God either exists or does not exist. There is no third option. If the no God position, atheism, clearly fails to account for logical absolutes from its perspective, then it is negated and the other option is verified. Atheism cannot account for the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, namely the existence of logical absolutes. Therefore, it is invalidated as a viable option for accounting for them, and the only other option, God exists, is validated. Now what Slick has attempted to do here, and as his first premise actually states, is present a disjunctive syllogism, which simply stated is a logical argument of the form that if there are only two possibilities and one of them is ruled out, then the other must be true. Or in its logical form it is A or B, not B, therefore A. In addition to this, he insists that his second premise, that God either exists or does not exist, is a valid dichotomy, because the two positions are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive, meaning that both positions can't be true, and that one must be true because between them they cover all possibilities. And, if he's willing to slightly tweak the wording for clarification purposes, he's right. Either the Christian God exists or the Christian God does not exist. This is a valid dichotomy. But now we move to his third premise, and this is where things get a little bit tricky, slippy, and slicky. When Slick states that, if the no God position, atheism, he is conflating the Christian God does not exist proposition with, and only with, the atheist position, which is not the only Christian God does not exist position. Buddhism is a Christian God does not exist position. Hinduism is a Christian God does not exist position. Egyptian polytheism is a Christian God does not exist position, and the list goes on and on and on and on, meaning that even if the atheist position cannot account for logical absolutes, which is an assertion that I don't accept, it does not logically follow that only the Christian God can. Or in other words, Slick's third premise commits a subtle but game-ending black and white fallacy, because it implicitly asserts that only one of two positions can account for logical absolutes, that being Christianity or atheism, when, as we've just demonstrated, these aren't the only positions. And this puts Slick in a very difficult situation. He must either go back to the drawing board and comprise a new argument, or he has to adopt the impossible burden of proof of first knowing every single position or worldview currently known and currently unknown, and then prove that each of these positions cannot account for logical absolutes, before he can legitimately say that the only other option, God exists, is validated, which, as I've just mentioned, is quite literally impossible. And this means that it's checkmate. Game over. Now I'd normally leave it here, but after much consideration I've decided to really hammer home this flaw, by composing a very similar argument that suffers from exactly the same flaw in exactly the same way, but without the fluff. And so for what it's worth, please consider the following. Valhalla either exists or does not exist. There is no third option. If the no Valhalla position, Hinduism, is negated, then the other option is verified. Hinduism is negated, and therefore it is invalidated as a viable option, and the only other option, Valhalla exists, is validated. Just as within this argument the Hindu position is but one of many positions that don't posit the existence of Valhalla, in Slick's argument, atheism is but one of many positions that don't posit the existence of the Christian God. And hence, just as the Valhalla argument commits a black and white fallacy, so does Slick's Transcendental argument. And because of this, the conclusion of both arguments are non sequiturs. And finally, I'm going to point out just one more ridiculous flaw with Slick's argument. If we switch the word God with Zeus, then the argument proves the existence of Zeus, because if the no Zeus position, atheism, clearly fails to account for logical absolutes from its perspective, then it's negated, and the other option is verified. Now there are many more flaws with Slick's Transcendental argument, and I've left a few links in the description to others exposing them, including Alex Malpass. But within this video, I've deliberately chosen not to point them all out, because if I'm honest, they're not necessary, and considering that people already find this argument confusing, I've decided to keep my response simple. And so, to recap, Slick's Transcendental argument for God is flawed because Premise 3 commits a subtle but game-ending black and white fallacy, and consequently, Premise 4, the conclusion, is a non sequitur. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and I'll leave you with a potently relevant quote from Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it.